Welcome to the Gold News Channel. My name, once again, Kerry Stevenson, and today a little bit different. I'm up here on the Gold Coast and I've managed to get some time with Professor Ian Plimer. Many of you will know that Professor Plimer has spent many years in the resources sector, and he also is a professor of geology, a professor of earth sciences. He's written a number of books. His latest book, written in 2021, is called Green Murder. Now, last night, Ian spoke here on the Gold Coast at a climate and energy realist meeting. Now, I know this is not necessarily about gold, but Professor Plimer does have a wealth of information about what's going on at the moment. We're getting record electricity prices. People are concerned about inflation, the higher costs of living, etc., etc. So I thought I wanted to, get a briefing of what he spoke about last night and just share that with our audience today. So welcome to the Gold News Channel, Ian. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
Now, last night you spoke at a meeting here on the Gold Coast. What was the talk about?
Well, basically, there are three areas of fact. The first is that no one has ever shown that human emissions of carbon dioxide drive global warming. It's never been shown. And yet we've built this whole infrastructure based on something that's never been proven.
Well, hasn't it been proven? I'm reading things that it has been proven, and that the science does show that the...
Well, that's not the case. I have asked chief scientists, I've asked scientists in the business just to give me half a dozen scientific papers to show me, just to prove to me that human emissions drive global warming. It hasn't been done. They can't do it. And if they could do it, then they'd have to show that the natural emissions, which are only 97% of the annual average, the natural emissions don't drive global warming. It's never been done. And I've been asking this question for 25 years. There is not one textbook or scientific paper that proves that human emissions drive global warming. The second thing is that we've known for only 200 years from Henry's law in chemistry and from ice core drilling that there's a slight problem with the narrative. The narrative is that we sinful humans pump more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. As a result, the planet warms. But when we collect ancient snow, that snow had fallen, picked up a bit of air on the way through, dropped onto the ice sheets, eventually got compressed into ice, and more snow goes on top. And we can put drill holes into that, and we can collect the ice, and from that, from chemical fingerprints, we can work out what the temperature was, and we can collect little bubbles of the ancient air.
Oh, really?
And we find that air tells us the secret, something we've only known for 200 years, and that is that when temperature naturally rises, then 650 to 6,000 years later, the carbon dioxide content rises. It's the exact opposite of what we're being told. Now, this we see from modern data, this we see from the laws of chemistry. And the third thing is when we look back in time, and that's my job as a geologist to look back in time, we see that we've had 6 major ice ages. 6 out of these 6 started when there was more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than now. Only 1,000 times more, just a little difference here and there. So what that's telling us is that in the past, carbon dioxide hasn't driven climate change. High carbon dioxide certainly hasn't given us runaway greenhouse effect or global warming. And the narrative is demonstrably wrong.
So what you're saying, if I can interrupt you, you're saying that when carbon dioxide increases in the atmosphere, that precedes an ice age. So you...
No, not at all.
No,
not
okay,
at all.
Got that wrong.
What I'm saying is that we've had great ice ages form at times when we've had very high carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The ice ages are driven by different reasons, and they're driven by pulling apart and stitching back together the continents. They're driven by having the wrong galactic address. They're driven, and these are cycles, and driven by orbital cycles where we go from circular to elliptical cycles, where we change the axis of the Earth, where we wobble a bit like a top, where we have oceanic cycles, where we have solar cycles every 10,000, 1,500 and 200 years, and every 22 years, and lunar tidal node cycles, which are every 18.6 years. So we've got cycles of climate, and the times when we've got a couple of these overlapping, and especially when we're in a bad galactic address, we will get an ice age. It's got nothing to do with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It never has. So just because you're living today and emitting carbon dioxide doesn't mean that you are driving a major planetary process. That's just ego that's gone berserk.
Well, what do you say to these people that are out there saying the Earth cannot sustain itself in its current form, and that we are ruining the Earth, and that we won't have enough food, we won't have enough materials, if you like, to be able to do what we do, and we need to protect the Earth, and as humans we're not doing that. The IPCC report, I think, said that the Earth is getting warmer, and that could be dangerous to humans.
Well, you've asked me about 10 questions.
Sorry, I do that quite often.
The answer to that is get your smartphone. It'll only take you 30 seconds to show that everything that you've said is just not valid. For example, you can look at your smartphone and look at past temperatures. We've been much, much warmer in the medieval warming 1,000 years ago. We were much warmer in the Roman warming 2,000 years ago, much warmer in the Minoan warming. We had a temperature maximum in the peak of the current interglacial we're in, and that was about 4,000 years ago. Over the last 4,000 years, we've been cooling. Over the last 4,000 years, sea level's gone down a little bit. This is contrary to everything that the propaganda tells us, but get your smartphone. Just look it up. Look up the Minoan warming, look up the Roman warming. So the first thing is that it's very easy to have emotion without data.
Right.
And what you've been presenting is emotion without data. Now, we know that we have cycles of climate, and we finished the last glaciation in the Northern Hemisphere 14,400 years ago, and since then we've been warming up. We reached the peak of that warming between 7,000 and 4,000 years ago, and since then we've been cooling. So if you want to tell me the planet's warming, I'll say since when? If you look at the last 300 years, the planet has been warming. Why? Because we've been coming out of the Little Ice Age. What do you think it's going to do after the Little Ice Age? Is it going to warm or is it going to cool? If you ask me, is the planet warming? I'll say since when? And I'll say, oh, well, since the medieval warming. The answer is no. We're 5 degrees cooler than 1,000 years ago.
Right.
If you ask me, is the planet warming? Since when? Well, Viking times. Since Viking times, the temperature's gone up. Since the time of Jesus, the temperature's gone down. So it's an invalid question to say the planet's warming. The planet goes through cycles of warming and cooling. And since we've had thermometer measurements globally, which has been since about 1850, we've had 3 cycles of warming and 2 of cooling and 1 where nothing's happened. So even if carbon dioxide was meant to drive global warming, how come during the last 150 or 170 years or so, we've had 3 warmings, 2 coolings and 1 stasis? And we've had 2 great natural experiments that we've been able to look at to see what carbon dioxide has done. The first was the global financial crisis, and the second was the COVID crisis. And in both cases, we emitted less carbon dioxide. Industry cranked back, travel slowed down. So the amount of carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere decreased, yet temperature kept going at the same rate. And that was nothing.
That's interesting.
There was no change. And the second thing is the atmospheric carbon dioxide kept climbing at the same rate, showing us that, in fact, the natural emissions far outweigh anything the human emissions do. So we've had 2 great experiments in our lifetime. We've also got history to look at, and just use your smartphone. Just ask a simple question. When did we have the greatest floods in Eastern Australia? Well, they were in periods of a La Nina El Nino cycle, and the greatest ones were in the 50s and in the 30s, the mid-50s, right, which I remember, and in the 30s. Ask when the great bushfires were in Australia. They weren't in 2020. They were in 1939 and 1851. When did we have the greatest drought? It wasn't in your lifetime. No, you're not that old. It was in the Federation drought at the turn of the 19th to 20th century. So if you repeat a lie enough, people will believe it, and that's what's happening. I'm sorry, folks, but we are living in a really boring period of time. Nothing extraordinary is happening. There have been periods in the geological past when we've had huge periods of drought, long periods of drought, and these gave us the red rock sandstones. These are deposits that we look at for copper. We had huge periods of warmth and the sea with a different chemistry. This is when we got the major lead zinc deposits. We can tie all this into mineral deposits. Right. We can tie climate into that. We see that currently happening in the Red Sea. When the Red Sea level goes up, the hot springs on the floor of the Red Sea have got too much pressure on them and they slow down. When it goes down, that's during a glaciation, then we get mineral deposits formed on the floor of the Red Sea. So we've got all these different lines of evidence we can use. And what we geologists are using is evidence, and that evidence is pitted against climate models, and these models make assumptions.
Right.
Now, we've got these models that go back now 40 years, and people 40 years ago were going to say we're going to fry and die. We've got 40 years of measurement now to show that, and that hasn't happened.
No.
The models are demonstrably wrong, and for any of you investors, try your financial models. They don't work. But what we do know from history is that if we had periods of high interest rates, high inflation, uncertainty, such as now, then buy gold.
Well, we are on the Gold News Channel, so I will come back to that for a moment, but let me ask you this. Why is it that in the past short period of time we've become so hysterical about having to be green and going electric? Because there's some challenges with that.
Well, we've become hysterical because we're too wealthy. We don't have to worry about where our next feed's coming from. We're not getting anyone shoot at us. We're not getting a major volcanic eruption threatening to wipe out civilization. We are very comfortable, and we are hardwired to be concerned about something. That's why we whistle in the dark. That's why we're frightened of things we can't see. That's why we look over our shoulder. And we're biologically hardwired to fear things. And we've got nothing to fear in such a wonderful, comfortable world. We are so affluent, we can then create these fears. And the best fears are those we can't see, things we can't see, like radiation or X-rays or carbon dioxide.
Or COVID.
Or COVID, yes. And those people in the third world don't have those fears.
No.
They want their kids to have an electric light that night so they can do their homework and get a better life. They want their kids to be able to eat. They want to be able to not get kidnapped by terrorists. That's their life. So it is a first world problem. Climate change is a global problem, if there's such a thing as climate change, that's induced by humans, and I am yet to see the evidence. So I think we've become so soft, we have to worry about something.
Right.
And that's what we're doing. We're worrying about things we can't see. And we're worrying about things we can't do anything about anyway. If the planet's climate is changing, it is such a major process involving so much energy transferred between ice, water vapour and water in the atmosphere. We can't affect that. Now, we also have got it wrong because the greatest greenhouse gas is water vapour. It's not carbon dioxide. Water vapour contributes to about 90% of the temperature of the atmosphere. If we didn't have water vapour, we'd be at a balmy, sweaty -18. Water vapour is the main greenhouse gas, and when you evaporate water from the oceans, you need energy to do it. So you take energy from the oceans, and you know it when you're perspiring. You feel cool because the water is evaporating from your skin, taking energy from your skin. And then when you precipitate that water, snow or rain, you give out energy. This is the way the atmosphere works, and we bring energy in currents, both air currents and water currents, from the equator down to the poles. And what we've got is a chaotic system with two fluids on a rotating planet, unevenly heated, shifting heat across the surface, getting pushed around by mountains that get in the way, and in the oceans by headlands and great submarine mountains. So we have a system which is very, very difficult, if ever, to be able to predict what's going to happen. So to try to argue that traces of a trace gas drive a major planetary system is a way of publicly demonstrating your ignorance.
There's talk about the number of metals and the number of elements that we'll need to go completely into this new electrical revolution, if you like. Do we have that sort of capability, and where do you think the challenges lie?
Well, two things. The great challenge is we haven't got them, we haven't found them, we haven't got the geologists to find them, we haven't got the mining engineers to take them out of the ground, we haven't got the mineral processors to extract them. So that's the first challenge. We just don't have the people or the resources. The second challenge is that if we did have them, we still don't have that metal, enough metal in the ground. And people seem to forget that if you want to mine these commodities, then you have to go through a process. And that process in the third world is quite often corrupt. In the first world, it takes time. So, for example, for the Roy Hill iron ore mine in the Pilbara in Western Australia, to build an iron ore mine in an iron ore mining state, in an iron ore mining country, it needed a couple of approvals, and it was only 4,950 approvals needed.
How many?
4,950 needed to build an iron ore mine in Australia. Now that is a process that costs a huge amount of money, and it costs a lot of time. So if you suddenly say, oh, we suddenly need graphite, and you're in a Western country, it's going to take you decades before you produce that graphite because of the logjam of our bureaucratic system. If you want to go to the third world, then most of the third world countries don't operate on our democratic systems that we have, where there's a degree of governance that minimises corruption. So a great example of this is cobalt. If you want to drive your electric vehicle and moralise to people that you're saving the planet driving an electric vehicle, then you have to ignore that 60% of the energy comes from coal. You have to ignore that the cobalt in that electric vehicle, most of that cobalt is mined by children who are black, who are slaves, who are in the Congo, and that cobalt goes to Chinese buyers. So if you want to be moral, you want to drive your electric vehicle, then you are supporting child slavery in Africa.
Wow.
So the Greens cannot take a moral position. I take the practical position. We've taken hundreds of years to develop very, very efficient systems, electrical systems, internal combustion systems. We tried electric cars in the 1830s. We also tried hydrogen cars in the 1830s, and they were abandoned for the right reasons. We tried hydrogen again as a fuel in the 1920s, and the Hindenburg put a stop to that. Yeah. And there are very good reasons, technical reasons, why you wouldn't use hydrogen, and there are very good economic reasons why you wouldn't use hydrogen. It's been tried before and it failed.
But hasn't technology come such a long way that now that we are able to use hydrogen as an energy source?
Well, we're certainly able to use hydrogen if it's subsidised. So you subsidise the wind and solar power to make subsidised hydrogen to have a fuel which you have to compress 700 times atmospheric pressure, which requires a huge amount of energy, and you have to cool it to minus 253, which requires a huge amount of energy. You can do it, but you have a few problems. The hydrogen atom is so small that it diffuses through metal, so it leaks out of a solid steel cylinder. It also makes that steel very brittle. So if you want to play with a fuel that's extremely dangerous, that's highly explosive, that has to be subsidised, and in making it, because you can't mine hydrogen, you've got to make it, and when you make it you have an energy loss, fine. And this is why it's being pushed, because there's an army of people out there who realise how stupid governments are. Our governments are quite happy to give away our money to subsidise schemes which don't work. And we've got a really good example of that in the UK. The UK government wanted to get rid of tungsten filament globes. So they said, righto, we're going to fund fluorescent globes, and we're going to give you subsidies for that. And they only spent about 15-20 billion on subsidising globes for the average punter in the UK.
So that's the average punter paying.
That's right.
Because that's the taxpayer.
And then the whole system fell apart because LED lights came on.
Right.
And so governments shouldn't be in the business of trying to predict technology, because firstly, that's not their job. Yep. Secondly, they need to get out of the way such that people can be creative and actually create new ways of being more efficient. But for governments to subsidise their chosen form of energy, like wind, or like solar, or like hydrogen, or subsidise electric cars, that is wasting my money.
Our money.
And that's wasting money on a scheme that the government shouldn't be involved in. And in many cases, it's a total disaster. We've seen it so many times, and we're seeing it happen right now. So what we've got is governments pillaging the public purse to the degree that we have to have printing of money to fund that, which gives us inflation. And bad policy gives us inflation.
Yeah, and right now we are in that inflation period.
Enormously bad policy. So, buy gold.
We'll get back to that in a moment.
That's twice you said that to me.
I know, but you have a wealth of knowledge, and right now we are, as you say, in an inflationary time. I can only see inflation. It's not transitory, it's here to stay. it's potentially going to get worse because governments need to print themselves out of this issue. Have they gone too far down the rabbit hole to turn around now? It's like turning the Titanic.
Well, ask me in 10 years' time. I think that's what makes markets. Some people are saying, well, we're going to get out of inflation, and we're getting various people in the US saying that we've reached maximum inflation, and we've got other people saying there's a long way to go. So I think this is what makes a market. Someone takes one view on the dollar, another person takes another view on the dollar, and you've got a market. So my personal view is that I think we're heading for quite dangerous times.
Well, speaking of dangerous times, I now will get to it. This is the Gold News Channel after all. Why do you say buy gold right now?
Well, God stopped making gold. She gave up. No more new gold's being made. And gold is a flight to safety. If you are in war-torn Ukraine and you want to leave Ukraine, you will leave with either diamonds or gold. But these are commodities where there's a high unit value commodity, and they are instantly tradable. So in times of uncertainty, gold always is where people fly to. In times of high inflation, people go to gold. In times of high interest rates, people hang on to gold. And gold is just not made anymore. All the gold that's been mined basically hasn't gone away. It's still there. But we've got a population now of over 7 billion people on planet Earth. We have some cultures, such as in India, where there's the wedding season and the use of gold goes up enormously. So gold is the fundamental commodity that has seen us through life. And if you go to your Bible, look up Genesis 2 verse 12. In Genesis 2 verse 12, there are 3 minerals. Gold is the first mentioned, bdellium, which is beryl, and the third one is onyx. And so in Genesis 2 verse 12, you have the first commodities, and these are precious stones and gold. And in Genesis 2 verse 24, there's a 12 verses later, then you've got to create a market. And that market was created when God took a rib of Adam and made Eve, and made women. And that was the market. So the Bible couldn't be wrong, could it? So I think that ancient knowledge is telling us that gold is always the fundamental commodity. And it's a store of wealth.
Would you say silver's the same?
Silver used to be worth more than gold because it was much more difficult to process than gold.
Right.
Silver minerals had to go through a very complex processing, cupellation process to create the silver. And for a long time, silver was worth much more than gold because gold was found as native gold, or most of it was found as native gold. And it was silver that allowed the ancient Greeks to give the Persians a flogging. From the Lavrian silver mines in Attica, they mined silver. That was enough wealth to be able to fund a navy to beat the Persians.
Right.
So silver then was worth more than gold, and silver changed the course of Western civilization.
Wow.
If the Greeks hadn't beaten the Persians, we would have been a Middle Eastern Western culture rather than relying on the Greeks and then the Romans and Western Europe. So precious metals have had a major part in the course of history.
Final question for you. You said a moment ago that there is not enough metals in the ground to go fully into this electric revolution. What do you think is going to be the answer going forward?
I think the answer is stick to what you know, stick to your knitting. And we have spent a long time developing cheap, reliable energy. And these are things such as coal, gas and nuclear. Stick to your knitting.
And stick to your knitting because there's going to be more people that want that cheap baseload power.
Well, it's appalling where the West wants to put up the cost of electricity for those in the third world. Because they'll never escape from the third world. So you can't be moral about the environment and yet keep people subjugated and under financial and food stress, and that's what's happening. So stick to your knitting, stick to what you know, and whether it's investing in gold or investing in oil or whatever, stick to your knitting.
Stick to the basics.
Yes.
Professor Ian Plimer, thanks so much for joining us on the Gold News Channel today.
Thank you.
I hope you found that of interest, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be back with more interesting and up-to-date speakers in the future, but for now, thanks for joining us on the Gold News Channel.